Lingua Mundi spells are really useful. They change the way you live, they change the way you fight, they change the way you play the game, and with these spells you can do almost anything. However, there are challenges to using them, as Lingua Mundi is a mod that really tries to make you feel like you're a wizard, and magic is not meant to be easy. However, that's where I come in. In this video, I will teach you all the key concepts that you need to create your very own spells. For all the effects a spell can evoke within the world, it's really just made of two things, a capsum and a cursorium. The capsum is a stack holding variables pertaining to a spell, while the cursorium is a queue holding instructions that act upon these variables. A stack is essentially a list of objects that obey the last in, first out principle. Objects are inserted by pushing onto the stack, and they are removed by popping the stack. The last object inserted is called the head, which is also the variable that will be removed and read if the stack is popped. Any kind of object can be inserted onto the stack, from numbers and vectors to even players. These different types of variables are described in Lingua Mundi as species. A queue is also a list of objects, but rather than last in, first out, it obeys the first in, first out principle. Objects are inserted into the queue by unqueuing them, and they're removed by dequeuing them. The first object inserted is called the head, and it's the first value removed from a queue when dequeuing. Queues are a good model for the cursorium, a list of instructions that every spell iterates through. The cursorium will be represented as shown on screen, with the pointer moving towards the right as instructions, or glyphs, are executed and dequeued. Firebolt is a simple spell that creates a damaging projectile. It's one of the easiest spells to make, but also an important foundation for more complex spells, discussed later on in the video. The Firebolt spell is cast using the Firebolt glyph. However, this glyph expects to pop a series of species from the capsum. It first expects a number, representing power, a value tied to the spell's damage and mana consumption. It then expects a vector for direction, and finally a vector for starting position. With all of these variables, the Firebolt glyph can cast a firebolt from a given point along a given direction to cause a given amount of damage. Now, let's look at how the Firebolt spell actually works. GetSelf pushes the caster onto the capsum. GetRayCastOrigin pops the entity at the head of the capsum and returns a vector corresponding to the position right below that entity's eyes. In this case, right below the caster's eyes, meaning that the firebolt will not block the caster's field of view. GetSelf, again, pushes the caster onto the capsum. GetLookVector pops an entity and returns the vector representing the direction it is looking in this case, the direction the caster is looking in. PushInteger pushes an integer onto the capsum. And finally, the Firebolt glyph pops a number and two vectors in order to produce a firebolt. In the second showcase, I will chain an explosion to the greater Firebolt glyph. The explosion glyph is self-explanatory. It causes an explosion of size depending on the power level, capped at 15. The greater fireball, however, is more interesting. It takes the same inputs as the firebolt, except it does much more damage, it deals splash damage, and power level not only determines damage, but also speed at ticks per second. Additionally, it's also able to load chunks as it flies, allowing casters to attack faraway targets. On the other hand, the explosion is a simpler glyph compared to the greater fireball or firebolt. It only takes a position vector and a power level in order to produce an explosion at the given position with the given power. Let's look at how this spell works. Initially, we'd cast the greater fireball in a very similar fashion to how we cast our firebolt. After casting the projectile, we would have an empty capsum and a projectile in transit towards its impact point. This is where we can use the wait for impact glyph to pause the spell while the projectile is in the air. Eventually, the projectile will hit something, causing it to return onto the capsum a special species called a result, and prompting the spell to resume execution. The expect vector position glyph unpacks this result and extracts the vector position held inside, corresponding to the point of impact of the projectile that produced the result. If no vector is found, the glyph is also able to safely terminate the spell. Next, PushInteger pushes an integer onto the capsum, and finally, the explosion glyph consumes an integer and a position in order to produce an explosion. Just some final remarks. I know I've shown glyphs in sets of 6, adjacent and on the same line. This is just for the sake of compactness and presentation. Glyphs can be separated by spaces, even by rows, as long as the order they're read in is preserved. That is, from left to right, row by row, from top to bottom. Separately, as seen in the video, casting projectiles is pretty much the same regardless of the specific glyph you use. If you know how to cast a firebolt, you know how to cast a fireball, you know how to cast an icicle, etc. Many things in this mod follow patterns, and often, if you learn one thing, you also learn how to do other similar things. What's important is to consider the glyphs you want to use, the inputs they require from the capsum, and what your capsum looks like as your spell executes. With these things in mind, you can pretty much make any spell that comes to your imagination. I urge you to use the in-game guide. It has information on each glyph, on what it needs from the capsule, on what it returns to the capsule, and other practical considerations. The guide also covers more general topics pertaining to spellcrafting, including many of the concepts I mentioned in this video. I plan to make the next video about stave crafting, which is crucial for casting spells in survival. However, it would be helpful to me if you could comment suggestions for what you want me to cover, as this would allow me to create content that is helpful to you. Finally, the Discord and mod download links are included in the description. With this said, thank you and happy spellcrafting.